Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for a very special Juneteenth program. My name is Raheem Thompson. I'm the manager of public programs. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, and the entire museum, I would like to thank everyone in attendance tonight for joining us. I started working for the museum 4 months ago, and one of the first assignments I was given was to come up with a Juneteenth program. And at the time, I was watching HBO's The Watchmen, and that's when I was first introduced to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And I couldn't believe something like that was true. So I spent my whole night just researching and researching, and I found out that the 100th anniversary was coming up. And I pitched this idea to Kelly and everyone at the museum, and they thought it was a great idea. And what better way to celebrate Juneteenth and the 1921 Race Massacre with getting people who are actually involved and people who are actually from Tulsa to educate us and highlight everything about it. Tonight we have an all-star panel featuring our moderator, Dr. David Gray, who is a teaching professor in the American Studies program at Oklahoma State University. He currently teaches a course on the Tulsa Race Massacre. He is a historian of work, and he recently published a book on the history of workplace motivational ideology. Dr. Gray will moderate a panel filled with two great individuals who's doing phenomenal work based on the past and the present of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. I would like to welcome Dr. David Gray.
Well, thank you, Raheem, and hello, everybody. So it's an honor to have been asked to moderate the conversation tonight. A discussion of race and reconciliation in America would be important at any juncture, but this year and this summer are steeped in special significance. 2021 is, of course, the centennial year of the Tulsa Race Massacre. It was 100 years ago, on May 31st and June 1st, that a white mob invaded the Black community of Greenwood. The assault resulted in an estimated 300 deaths, the vast majority of whom were African American, and the destruction of more than 35 blocks, and with them over 1,200 buildings, including homes, businesses, and churches. The massacre was the largest of a wave of mob attacks on Black communities between 1917 and 1923, though there were others before and after. Tonight's event focuses on the efforts to bring fuller attention to the massacre and to achieve racial reconciliation. But it also marks Juneteenth, which will be this coming Saturday. Held on June 19th since the end of the Civil War to commemorate the emancipation of enslaved Blacks, Juneteenth has long embodied hopes of racial justice. This is even more so in the wake of escalating police killings of African Americans, including that of George Floyd last year. Greenwood's Juneteenth commemorations came into the national spotlight last year when President Donald Trump scheduled a political rally in Tulsa on that day. The rally was eventually rescheduled for the following day, but the event stoked pain in a Black community and in a city grappling with the looming centennial of the most destructive race massacre of the 20th century. In holding this conversation, the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center has provided an important opportunity to discuss Greenwood's past and its future, and to pay respects to those who died and suffered, and not least to the survivors. I'd like to thank the museum and its programming team for hosting the event. I also want to celebrate the fact that Illinois recently passed legislation making Juneteenth a paid day off for all state employees and a school holiday. And as I'm sure everybody knows, just last night, Congress voted to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. Presumably that's even been, signed into law today, I'm not sure, or tomorrow. Tonight's guests work in different fields and have different kinds of expertise, but together they can speak to the historical and to the more recent legacies of the massacre, as well as the struggle for racial reconciliation in Tulsa. I myself am familiar with the massacre through a different route. My experience teaching courses about it in the American Studies program at Oklahoma State University, Tulsa. Although I'm not a specialist in the history of the massacre, nor certainly not of Greenwood, I'm honored to moderate the conversation. The event will go till 7:30, and the final 15 minutes will consist of audience Q&A. So feel free to submit questions or comments to the link that you'll presumably see down there at the bottom of the screen. And I'll do my best to introduce as many of them as I can, beginning around 7:15. Okay, so to our guests. Carlos Moreno is the author of The Victory of Greenwood, a recent book which includes 20 historical biographies and that dispels the myths and inaccuracies about the events leading up to the massacre through newly discovered sources. It also traces Greenwood's local and national significance from its rebuilding to the present day. He earned a Master of Public Administration from the University of Oklahoma and is a graphic designer at CAP Tulsa, Oklahoma's largest anti-poverty nonprofit organization, and a national leader in early childhood education. In addition, he's a serial entrepreneur, a writer, and a community activist, and serves on the boards of several educational and civic organizations in Tulsa. Phil Armstrong is project director for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. He worked with the commission, its subcommittees, and key Greenwood District organizations to execute plans for the 100th anniversary of the massacre. He also helped to oversee the construction of Greenwood Rising, which was chosen to provide a world-class history center located at the corner of Greenwood and Archer, the gateway to Tulsa's historic Greenwood District. He holds a master's degree in public administration from the University of Akron and has made Tulsa his home for more than 20 years. He has a background in the corporate sector and as an entrepreneur. He also served on various nonprofit boards and as the chair of the board for the Greenwood Cultural Center. Carlos Moreno and Phil Armstrong, welcome to you both. Good to see you both.
Great to be here.
Yeah. All right. Well, I have some questions for each of you that are sort of tailored for each of you, but I thought it would be good to just kick things off by asking you both why you do the work that you do, and what you hope that work brings to the conversation about the massacre, its legacies, and the struggle for reconciliation. So we'll just sort of check in on this for a few minutes. So Carlos, maybe we can begin with you.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I'm very, very glad to be here. I am originally from the San Francisco Bay Area and moved to Tulsa in 1998. As a young entrepreneur, as a young graphic designer, it was really the community of Greenwood that gave me my first shot. All of my first clients were all Greenwood businesses and nonprofits and institutions. And so I really became interested and involved in learning about Greenwood, studying Greenwood. I freelanced for the Oklahoma Eagle, which is the successor to the Tulsa Star, Tulsa's oldest Black newspaper and the first daily Black newspaper in the nation. And so just learning about that legacy is something that has always stuck with me. And so for the past 20 years, I've really just kind of collected anything and everything I could about Greenwood, every book, every documentary, every article I could get my hands on. And that really just culminated into a book that was published earlier this month, The Victory of Greenwood. And as you mentioned, I really focused more on the history of the community after 1921 and its real cultural significance, not just to the city of Tulsa, but its impact in the nation during the civil rights movement, and in areas like transportation and technology and many areas that I think people would be surprised to read about.
For sure. And I also suggest people buy this book. It's really very good. I enjoyed it a great deal and learned a lot from it. So thanks for sharing that, Carlos. So Phil, how about you?
And I'll share the same sentiments as Carlos. Thank you to Dr. Gray and for Raheem Thompson for just thinking enough of us to center our program around this history. And for Raheem, wow, what an incredible first assignment to say, hey, plan something around Juneteenth. It's incredible that he was tasked with that. So my history with this goes all the way back to Ohio, and I've shared many times. I'm a proud graduate of an HBCU. For your listeners, that's a historically Black college and university. I attended Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio. Wilberforce, Ohio is the home of two HBCUs right across the street from each other. Central State came out of Wilberforce. Wilberforce University is declared as one of the oldest, if not the oldest, Black institution of higher learning. It was established in 1855, 8 years before the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. I give that history because for those that had the fortune of attending HBCUs, there was a time and a reflection of history that allowed you to research and find about things in your public school history books that were overlooked or never told. And one of those things that I was introduced to as a sophomore, this is back in 1991, I had no affiliation or connection to Oklahoma. I'm just a college student in Ohio. And my college professor, Dr. Edwin Clay, spent an entire quarter, 9 weeks, once a week class, and we talked nothing but about the history of Black Americans in the Oklahoma Territory at the turn of the century. And we discovered and learned all about the Black towns, Boley, Oklahoma, and Langston, and the rich history of Oklahoma as it relates to what Oklahoma became for Black Americans after 1865, which led to Greenwood, which led to the massacre, which back then was called the riot. We spent, again, an entire quarter. So I moved here in 1997 and literally was just shocked, just literally kind of appalled that the only really significant celebration or recognition of history was a 4-day music festival called Juneteenth. So it's interesting. I moved here and said, man, what a wonderful Juneteenth festival, but do you guys not know about your other history? So it was incredible that I, an Ohioan, knew more about this history than Blacks or whites that even went to school here, which later on I would find out would be something that was intentional and systemic. So, you know, to find myself in this position, to know how I was introduced to this and to, you know, to be entrusted, and that's how I believe I frame it. I've been entrusted by this community, by someone who wasn't born and raised here, to get this story right and to elevate it on a worldwide level so that we don't have anyone else grow up in Oklahoma and not know this history. And it's been an honor and a pleasure to work with people like Carlos and many others in our community to really shine a light on what's going on in Greenwood, what's been here, and what continues to grow here in Greenwood and Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Well, thanks for sharing that. It's so great to, you know, kind of hear where you both come from and you sort of come, how you come to this subject and what motivates you. So thank you. Well, listen, let's go to Carlos. As I say, I've got some questions for each of you. So Carlos, I mean, your speciality is history. You've just published this book that includes these biographies of a great many people who lived through the massacre. Also, you know, certainly at least one person who died in the massacre, Dr. Andrew Jackson. But as you emphasize, the book isn't about the massacre. It's principally about the rise and then the rebuilding of Greenwood and the lives of the people who you trace in the book. So, I mean, why were you drawn especially to the histories of individuals? Because there's so many ways of approaching a subject, right? And you sort of, you know, made the choice to sort of look at these individuals chapter by chapter. And also, I mean, how did you go about choosing? Because it must have been kind of a tricky, you know, task, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there's so many individuals and families that I wish I could have written more about. I'll sort of answer your second question first. You know, the selection process was more about, you know, could I find enough material about this individual or about this family that I could really build a story and a chapter around. There's so many myths and legends that are in Greenwood. People like California Taylor. There's a legend of a doctor who came up with a potential cure for the AIDS virus. And there are many different myths and legends and stories, but I really intentionally wanted to stick very closely to what could I trace with primary sources? What could I back up with a primary document, a birth certificate, a court case file, somebody's land deed, those types of documents. So it's really about, what I could back up with a primary source that wasn't just a story or a legend. And in looking at the bookshelves when I first began this project, there was, really just a bookshelf full of black and white photographs of the destroyed Greenwood, and books that focused only on the massacre itself and didn't really talk about the history of Greenwood after 1921 and how the community rebuilt. And so I really felt like that was missing in our city's cultural narrative. I think that we have this sort of narrative in Tulsa that the history of Greenwood ends in 1921 and nothing happens ever since in North Tulsa or in Black Tulsa. And, nothing could be further from the truth. And also I really felt like people might connect in a different way than had I written a more academic book or a more historically focused book. In writing, going chapter by chapter, focusing on a different person, I felt like people may connect to the neighborhood of Greenwood in a very different way. And so I kind of wanted to bring that forward.
Yeah. No, great. I mean, and you're kind of working in the tradition in a way, right, of Eddie Fay Gates, who you have a chapter on, in the sense that, you're sort of looking at these individuals and telling their stories. And I kind of love that chapter where you sort of talk about her work. And so, I kind of like that. I mean, as a teacher, my students love these kinds of books where we're sort of following individuals, through history. And so I really kind of liked that. And also, I mean, some of the people who you write about lived really fascinating lives. I mean, the history's touched on everything from, medicine to business, from the military to science, for the church, activism, some of these things which sort of overlapped as well. And so, it seems like focusing on individuals kind of offered a way to get at some larger histories as well. And obviously, I mean, you cover a lot of ground in the book. I wonder if you could sketch out for us what you see as some of the most important issues arising from the history of the massacre and the history of Greenwood that you hope that people will kind of pay attention to today. I mean, in some ways, you've just sort of gestured to some of them, but for you, what are the big things that, you would sort of hope people would focus on if it's not the massacre itself as we move forward?
Yeah, I think that there's both good and bad in that. I talk at length about the founding of the state of Oklahoma, and how Oklahoma was this very prosperous, before it became a state. Indian Territory was offered many prosperous opportunities for Black Americans. But then Oklahoma becomes a state in 1907, and you really start to begin to see the first Jim Crow laws arise from that. You see a housing ordinance passed by the city of Tulsa in 1916 that segregates the city by law. And that law was not repealed until 1963. And so, and then, kind of the flip side of that, I wanted people to really learn about the history of the desegregation of Tulsa's schools. Mabel Little was an important part of that advocacy, and the important people who played a role in influencing, as you said, many different fields. Dr. A.C. Jackson being praised by the Mayo Clinic. People like Emmett J. McHenry, who grew up in Greenwood, graduated Booker T. Washington High School, and went on to found Network Solutions, the exclusive domain name provider for much of the 1990s. So if you registered a domain name in the 1990s, you were purchasing it from Emmett J. McHenry, who is largely responsible for the creation of the commercial internet as we know it today. There would be no Zoom.com or Facebook.com or Twitter. We wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't for Emmett J. McHenry in many ways. And so to find out that someone like that grew up in Greenwood was inspiring to me, and I wanted to share those stories and inspire others.
Yeah, no, I loved all of that. And, the chapter on Mabel B. Little was, particularly sort of powerful. And, thinking about kind of, the plundering of the community and people like her and her husband, Presley, who you sort of write, they lost everything, the salon that they had, the restaurant, and her husband never managed to get back into that strata again. And I found all of that really interesting. And then you take us into urban renewal and all kinds of things. So the thing I guess, which is a big theme, particularly in the second half of the book, but really all the way through, is the involvement of members of the Greenwood community in the civil rights movement and civil rights activities, both actually before the massacre, but then in particularly, in the decades that followed, a really big theme of the book. What are some of the, for people that haven't read your book yet, what are some of the ways in which people in Greenwood participated in civil rights efforts?
Yeah, so, we think of, for example, sit-ins at deli counters happening in the Deep South in the early parts of the civil rights movement, which of course did occur, but you can go back to as early as 1958 with Clara Luper in Oklahoma City. And those sit-ins that in fact, the idea for the sit-ins came from her 8-year-old daughter. And so to sort of have that kind of context and then know that the sit-ins that she participated in Oklahoma City made their way up to Tulsa. And there were similar protests in very famous Tulsa cafes, Piccadilly's and Borden's Cafe here in Tulsa. And through those protests, there came to be actually a church movement where 75 churches all signed a petition to the city of Tulsa to desegregate restaurants and hotels in the city of Tulsa, and they succeeded in that. And so, again, a hugely inspiring story, and something that really, because Greenwood was connected through fraternal organizations, through the NAACP, and through other organizations nationwide, this sort of inspired similar sit-ins throughout the country. Mm-hmm. And so Greenwood, you see Greenwood playing a very important part in, as you said, in the civil rights movement, leading up to the more famous protests in Alabama and places like that.
Well, I mean, I was even, sort of fascinated by some of the things that you wrote about that, we don't necessarily think about always as civil rights, but they are. You've got people who you trace here doing all kinds of things, say in the medical profession with Dr. Bate, I think it was, who is sort of fighting against these race-based exclusionary practices in the profession. You've got, we mentioned Mabel B. Little, who's just doing everything, doing all kinds of things. But you've got, Amos T. Hall, who's working on the desegregation of law schools. And then I've found the part on Homer Johnson and others who are sort of working on these anti-poverty organizations like Vista, which, you know, gets kind of like shut down by the Nixon administration. All of these things are kind of, and you know, the educational work that Dr. Olivia Hooker and Otis Clarke do, in some ways are, you know, they don't often get called civil rights, but they are, aren't they? They're all sort of to do with these sort of interlocking things. So I think there's such a lot going on here about that. And also, you know, the Pink House, I'd never heard of that before. This is some kind of hangout, I think, that you mentioned, where, you know, civil rights activists would get together. I thought, I'd never heard about that, you know. So there's a lot going on.
Yeah, you know, Greenwood and Tulsa jazz is you know, quite well known throughout the nation. Greenwood being very influential in the jazz world, but these jazz clubs, you know, while at night they were you know, popular hangouts and, you know, a place to sing and dance and enjoy music, during the day they were organizing, you know, like you said, anti-poverty initiatives, some of the first school volunteer initiatives, some of the first parenting programs. You mentioned Homer Johnson. Homer Johnson holds a very special place in my heart, since I work today for CAP Tulsa, which is a nationally recognized Head Start nonprofit. And CAP Tulsa would not be CAP Tulsa what it is today if it was not for Homer Johnson. So that his story is definitely one that I wanted to make sure was in the book.
Yeah, I learned a lot from that, you know, because as somebody who knows quite a bit about the race massacre, but not really too much about that period and what's going on in Greenwood, I kind of felt like I learned a lot. So, well, great. Well, listen, let's bring in Phil Armstrong. So, I mean, Phil, I mean, your work for the Centennial Commission focuses in many ways on the present and the future of Greenwood. That said, I mean, you know, you're sort of working on Greenwood Rising, which is a history museum. But what are some of the main projects and initiatives that the Commission has undertaken, if we leave aside just for the moment Greenwood Rising, and what have been some of the main goals?
So overall, the Commission, and let me back up and really give some context to your listeners. Yeah. You know, when you get to this side of any project, you look back on and you say, you know, what could we have done different? You know, what are some things that we could have, you know, lessons learned? And obviously, one of the things that we probably should have reevaluated was actually calling ourselves a commission. And what we were doing was referencing, you know, the original and the only state-appointed government entity that was appointed by the state of Oklahoma. That was the Oklahoma State Commission to study the Tulsa race riot of 1921, that was called. That was the official state-supported, taxpayer-funded, you know, statewide Republicans, Democrats, bipartisan board put together. It was led by the director of the Oklahoma Historical Society, Bob Blackburn, and then locally, our strongest leadership in that was Oklahoma's State Senator Maxine Horner, who just actually passed and left us all too soon, champion for Greenwood just within the last couple of months, and then Representative Don Ross. That was from 1987 to 2001. Much of the history that people are able to stand on in terms of research that was done came out of that 200-page report. From the search of the mass graves, it came out of the report, to the eyewitness accounts and the witnesses from the survivors from the Eddie Faye Gates collection. That's in that report that led to, you know, the legislation that was filed in 2001 for reparations, to the acknowledgement and the complicit of the determination that the Oklahoma National Guard, the state of Oklahoma, the Tulsa Police Department, Tulsa officials were all complicit in what took place. All came from that 5-year report, and it ended with 5 specific recommendations for reparations. That, number 1, monetary cash payments are deserving from these complicit organizations to those who were still living in descendants and survivors. That there should be a revitalization of an economic empowerment zone for Greenwood, for Black-owned homes and Black-owned businesses, for educational scholarships. The list went on, 5 specific recommendations. And what we were cognizant of is Here we are 20 years later, and not one of those 5 policies that the state paid for have ever been enacted upon. Is just sitting on someone's desk somewhere, a 200-page report, because this has been quiet, hush, hush, has been kept away from most citizens around the country, around the world. So this commission really began with the state Senator Kevin Matthews really looking at and challenging questions of, if we're going to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing, what are we going to do for the worst case of bombing and domestic terrorism took place on American soil, and we're about to approach the 100th anniversary. Before we commemorate the 25th anniversary of Oklahoma City, we should at least do something for the worst tragedy that's almost 100 years old and we've done nothing. That's really what got conversations going. And he started meeting with community organizations, Greenwood Culture Center, which I was a board chair, John Hope Franklin, with Greenwood Chamber, and many community participants to say, we need to do something. Let's collaborate. Let's bring all voices to the table, just like the first commission, Republicans, Democrat, rich, poor, black, white. Let's talk about how we come together and commemorate this history. And then it was kind of like, hey, we keep having these meetings. What are we going to call ourselves? Well, let's call ourselves the Centennial Commission. Was great, really, but it kind of confused and said, you know, is this a state body? Is it not? And we were not. We literally was just a community organization that called themselves the commission. So I wanted to put that context and that history in. But our objective was to really do what's been done, to bring a national awareness, to lift up the awareness of what happened in Greenwood of Oklahoma, what was here, how Oklahoma was a paradise, a respite for Black citizens in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Before you get to a Greenwood, you got to understand how Black people got their wealth, how they got to Oklahoma in the first place. We wanted to tell the full history and really take those witness statements that is in that 200-page document. One of the overwhelming themes that came out of their statements is that they said, we want people to know our story. We want people to hear our story. And so the commission's goal was, how do we honor their wishes? And that is to tell the story. And that's how we got to these projects that would make it so when people come here, you see this wonderful history center, you see the Pathway to Hope, you see all these community investments that create a space and a place. Really learning from our you know, we're here hosts and guests of the Illinois Holocaust Museum. We learn from what we've seen our brothers and sisters do in the Jewish community. You tell your story, you build a Holocaust museum. People come and learn your history, see what the Jewish people went through, how white supremacy and racism tried to annihilate and destroy that community, and yet they are still alive and vibrant and well. We learned that what happens when people learn your history. Here in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the Cherokee Nation that builds a multi-million-dollar complex for people to come and learn the history, learn about the Trail of Tears, learn of all the ups and downs and why they're so proud of what they have achieved in spite of all the ups and downs of being mistreated in the Native American population in America. What happens when people want to come and learn that history? So we learned that. And then after they built the National African American Museum in Washington, D.C., and 25 million people visit that center in 1 year, and they have an entire exhibit, an entire room dedicated to the 1921 Tulsa race riot. We came back in 2018 and said, you know what? It's wonderful that they have that there, and we applaud that, but who better to tell the story than the community which this happened? We should have a place here for people to have an immersive experience and get a full understanding of the history of Greenwood, of Black Oklahomans, and do it on a world-class level right here in Greenwood. That's really what led to a lot of the work and the raising of money and awareness with donors and citizens to say, people should come here and experience this. And when they get here, then what do? Then, hey, you learn this history, now go walk this history. Mm-hmm. This entire district is filled with the Greenwood Cultural Center, Vernon AME Church, the Black Wall Street Mural, the John Hope Franklin Center, and the park, Standpipe Hill. E.W. Woods, Booker T. Washington Memorial. We send them on a day-long journey. You've learned it here from Greenwood Rising. Now go take a walk and see all of these wonderful icons of our community that's been here for 20 years, some of them longer than that, but no one has been aware of them on a worldwide level. Well, now everyone will know about Greenwood. It's much more than just a history center. It gets people on this path to come and see this place called Greenwood and learn this full history.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that background. And all of that brings us, right into the next question, which, is about Greenwood Rising. So you've given us, a great deal of sort of really useful context. So, I mean, can you tell us what kinds of exhibits and experiences visitors will encounter when they go through those doors? And we have the full opening on, I think you said it's the 14th of July. You mentioned a couple of things, but what kinds of things are people going to encounter?
So again, taking from the Eddie Faye Gates collection and the witness statements and listening to the community, we actually had three community meetings before we started going down this road of what the community would want to see if we were going to do something. And the overwhelming response, the majority responses was simply this: don't just talk about the massacre. We understand the massacre is what brings people here, but we have Greenwood Culture Center, the Survivors Gallery, and the 1921 Memorial that stands there. We have John Hope Franklin Park with the beautiful statue in the middle that's dedicated to those who lost their lives. The community was saying enough with the memorials. We love them, we respect them, but we want people to know the full history. We don't want them to just think that we're just a community that was destroyed. They want people to hear this incredible history that no one knows. So, we actually got input from community members on if we were to build a history center, what would you want to see? And just of the things that I've mentioned. So there's three themes you'll hear and receive, and that is the spirit of Greenwood, how Black Oklahomans got to Oklahoma, how they acquired their wealth, how this place like Greenwood came about. They'll learn in the second phase, the arc of oppression, which will cover the systems of anti-Blackness, that the massacre did not operate in a vacuum by itself, but there were these things taking place, as Carlos has just mentioned. One of the worst things, ironically, one of the worst things that happened to Native Americans and Black Americans in Oklahoma is when Oklahoma became a state. Things were going just fine. When it became a state, that's when things started going down the wrong direction in terms of Jim Crow and segregation. But talk about and show people this pattern, these systems that were put in place that started building racial animosity to the point where all you needed was a striking of a match and excuse the pun, but an explosive incident to happen. And that was the elevator incident between Dick Rowland and Sarah Page. You learn that, you see that, you go through the race massacre exhibit where you actually hear the voices of those that were recorded by Eddie Faye, and you see this visual immersive of what that day took place, and you sit and watch and hear their voices describe the events of that day, and you get the full immersive content. And then, of course, we don't leave you in that low place, but then you turn the corner, you come into the third phase, which is the journey to reconciliation, the Changing Fortunes Gallery, how Greenwood citizens rebuilt their community, how it became economically twice the size of what it was and became bigger and better after the destruction, and then leads you to what happened. It leads you to urban renewal and how the second destruction came in. And the final space of the journey to reconciliation is a discussion gallery, giving people an opportunity, an amphitheater style room, classroom equipped type of room where we will have programmatic discussions, where we will host community meetings to have discussions with people about race, about what still divides us 100 years later, the prejudices, the biases, and in some pockets of our country, the racial animosity and the racist mindsets that still keep us separated. That's where the magic's going to happen. Greenwood Rising is to be a place for healing from historic racial trauma and to put us on a path, a true path to reconciliation and racial harmony. And you've got to get people in a safe space to talk, to share, to have opportunities to talk to each other, and stop talking at each other, but talk to each other. If Greenwood Rising was alive and well in 2020, the number of community programs that we would have hosted right there in Greenwood Rising For example, let's have a community meeting and talk about the aftermath of a shooting of a Ahmaud Arbery. You know, a black man just running through a neighborhood. Prejudices and biases say, he must be the one that's been breaking into homes. Yeah, I just saw him come out of the house over here. Let's go get him. There are some, it's 2020, and we're still dealing with those type of divided prejudices, mindsets that would cause a young black man to be murdered because he's running through a neighborhood that he's quote unquote not supposed to be in. What would happen if we had community meetings to talk about the aftermath of George Floyd and Black Lives Matters and the distrust between communities of color and some of those who wear the badge that have violated their rights and violated the usage of that authority and over years, where this mistrust of some in these communities have of police and where it comes from, and to talk about it, to have a space where we can really start to have some therapeutic, if you will, discussions. And that's what Greenwood Rising is really going to be. So when you leave, the last thing you do is to leave a commitment. We'll have a commitment chamber where you can then say, how can I make a personal commitment and leave it here to be displayed on a wall for in perpetuity of what I will do to commit to making changes in my own personal life for racial harmony and getting on this path. It can be as simple as I commit to supporting Black-owned businesses. It can be I commit to having lunch once a week with somebody who's different from myself. It could be there was one that was put up by a visitor the other day, and they committed and said, I commit to hiring more people of color in my company. I mean, these are things that people are saying, this is what I'm going to do. And they must hold themselves accountable. So Greenwood Rising really is going to change, using the backdrop of what happened 100 years ago to put us on a different path so the next 100 years are different than the previous 100 years.
Great, thank you. Well, listen, I got a couple of questions for both of you, so maybe we can sort of bring Carlos back in as well. And then, it's 12 minutes past 7. Let's see. One question is the concept of reconciliation. Of course, it means very different things to different people, right? It comes up in the classes I teach, and we have some interesting conversations. It means different things. One person's reconciliation involves more education, and other person's involves new laws. Others emphasize the need for a far broader approach in Tulsa to the search for mass graves, and for others it's economic reparations and even the end of racial capitalism. These are very different things, and we can imagine that spectrum. So I'm just curious about how you both would sort of try and how you both think about reconciliation, I guess, and we can sort of sense it in some of the answers so far. But how about Carlos? I mean, do you kind of carry a sense of what that means?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. We need to acknowledge this history. There's a lot of history, that Phil talked about the systems of oppression and the culpable parties in this attack on Greenwood. As Phil mentioned, the police department was involved, the National Guard was involved. There were 3 detention camps that were that had been planned to hold the citizens of Greenwood, and many were held there for weeks. While the Red Cross, coming in on June 2nd of 1921, was given the responsibility to care for the victims of this attack. And so, we think of this conversation about reparations. We think of it as a new conversation, but really on June 2nd, the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce itself comes out and says, we need to create a fund to help Greenwood repair. And under political pressure, they are forced to resign on June 15th. And so it's acknowledgement, it's education, it's knowing the complete history of not only the massacre, but like Phil mentioned, the things that led up to the massacre, the policies. You know, Mr. Armstrong and I both have a master's degree in public policy, so it's the policies that were in place, the laws that were in place that kept this community down. And you mentioned earlier, Professor Gray, urban renewal. I think that needs to be brought into the conversation. There's a recent article in Forbes magazine where they calculated, and the number that they came up with, it was $45 billion, as which I think is an appropriate figure. I tweeted after I saw that article, I said, you know, now we're talking. You know, because $100,000 here is and $100,000 there is not going to get it done. A meaningful, not just local government, but state and federal government acknowledgement and repair and reconciliation on an economic development level needs to happen as well. I'm quite supportive of the notion of putting federal dollars into removing highways that were built through historically Black and immigrant neighborhoods, something that happened in the neighborhood where my father grew up, and is a deep connection that I have, and something that I support, is removing the highway that runs through Greenwood.
All right. Well, listen, we've got some questions, but listen, Phil, I got to let you chime in on that one too.
Yeah.
And then we'll go to.
Oh no, I mean, Carlos. I mean, he hit out the park. I mean, everything. I mean, definitely. You know, the acknowledgement and what does reconciliation look like? It is acknowledgement, it's education, and then it's repair. It's repairing the damages, and that's really how we. And when I say we, I'm referring to the commission in terms of reparations. You know, our definition of what we've kind of made it a more broad term, and that is repairing past damages and making amends. Repairing past damages and making amends, which covers all monetary, investments in education, investments in economic development, environmental justice, as he's referring to in terms of I-244. What does it look like to move this highway that was built right through the economic center of this district and destroyed it? What if we buried it and made a tunnel underneath, or created a way for people to reclaim that area? All of these things are a part of reconciliation, recognizing that this terrible thing happened, and then, okay, we didn't do it, you weren't there, was not there, but we are stewards. We are stewards of what has been passed down to us, and we are in positions where we can make policy changes. We can put federal and state public dollars to mitigate what took place 100 years ago, to kind of say, hey, we're going to amend what we wasn't here, but we can make some changes to how we address this now, since it's 100 years gone by and nobody's addressed it. And the main thing for reconciliation is for people to understand there is no destination point. The journey is just that. You never arrive, okay, we're all reconciled. No, the journey is a continual addressing of this history so that we never repeat it, so that we never forget about it. Success on reconciliation comes when 20 years from now, children who were born in 2021 and in 2041, when they graduate any public school in the state of Oklahoma, and somebody asks them, do you know about Greenwood? Do you know about the race massacre? No matter what school they went to, they can say, yes, I was taught that quite a bit in school. You want to know about it? That is when reconciliation is really moved forward in Oklahoma.
Yeah, thank you. We'll go to some questions, but before we do, let me just throw in sort of my one observation I was going to share before and I didn't get to. When I came here, and I want to say 2010, and I began teaching about the massacre as part of a different course, one of the things I noticed really quickly was that in a lot of the books and the articles, and we see it today, when you read them, you can get the impression that everybody in Greenwood at the time of the massacre was a business person, was middle class, was a doctor or a surgeon. In actual fact, 60% of the community were working class. And you know, it's interesting to me, you know, that we don't sort of have the right class lens. And I understand why we sort of talk about the flourishing, you know, sort of business sector and Greenwood Avenue itself. But sometimes we don't kind of see that, you know, the bulk of the suffering was by working class people who didn't own their own homes. You know, they rented them, and they sort of took on, you know, the bulk of the suffering. And I wonder as we move forward whether that class lens might get sort of shifted a little bit, and we'll become more conscious of the complicated class dynamic. So I'm just sort of wanted to sort of mention that as something that I hope comes through, and maybe, you know, at the museum and in future books and articles and things like that.
Well, David, if I can take maybe 30 seconds and just give you a different perspective on it, and I thank you for bringing that out. But here's the perspective that we need to keep in mind. The 60% of the workers that you're talking about, because of segregation and Jim Crow, you know, they went and worked in white Tulsa, but they came back to their community and spent their money. They ate at restaurants. They had their neighbors. Life, no matter if you were Simon Berry and making $500 a day, or whether you were a domestic worker, you were enjoying life with your citizens in your community, going to the grocery store, and the guy who owned a grocery store looked like you, going to the gas station, going to the shoe store, going to the restaurant, going to the theater. Everybody looked like you that were owning the businesses. So it wasn't so much of this divisiveness. And yes, there was a divisiveness, or say, you know, different classes of people earning money, but the difference in what they had, the pride that they had, that maybe I'm not making as much money as Simon Berry, but I'm right here among my own people, thriving and prospering and supporting one another. I think that adds more of an element that we're not kind of considering, because we haven't had that. We don't know what it's like to have a community that is self-sustained, where the Black dollar circulates in that close insular community over and over again, and what it does for a sense of pride for that community.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. All right. That's reasonable. Let's see what we've got. Some questions here. I'm just going to pluck some out. Nicole asks, what efforts have the local public schools made to integrate the history into the curriculum, starting at the elementary level? Does one of you want to speak to that? Either of you have a sense of that? I know that it's, you know, it's coming much more into the curriculum. But of course, there's this sort of new conversation about critical race theory and so forth, which is, we don't even have time for tonight. It's kind of ridiculous. But this question about the race massacre coming into the curriculum, does anyone want to say something about it?
I'll jump in, and then Carlos can fill in whatever I missed. So one of the first things that the commission took control of, or I should say led the way into, was the educational curriculum. That was number one, and that happened in 2018. We spent 8 months working with the Oklahoma Education Department, and that's Dr. Joy Hoffmeister, working with Dr. Deborah Gist, the second largest public school district in the state, and we actually developed the curriculum on a system-wide level, so that teachers are teaching the same thing, that it's fundamental, that it's accurate, and develop the pedagogy. How you teach this to different age groups, so that different teachers and different age groups are teaching the same thing. So we did that, put that together, and actually announced that and released that in 2018. And so schools in the Oklahoma public school system now have the tools and the resources and are teaching it, that material now in schools. So, but that's my part. I'm sure Carlos can add more to that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Phil. I wasn't sure about the timing and about the institutions who were responsible for that. So I'm glad you answered that question. That the only thing that I would add is the Restorative Justice Institute of Oklahoma, which is led in part by Dr. Carlos Hill at Oklahoma University. Recently had a cohort of teachers participate in a day of learning, and that was earlier this month as well. And I think those workshops for teachers are going to continue. not only to teach the history, but as Phil mentioned, to teach how to teach the history in through the lens of race, through the lens of understanding the context. In addition to writing The Victory of Greenwood, I also wrote a children's book, a kid's book about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And, I think it is important for, students even as young as first, second, third grade to start learning about this history, learning about their community. They're going to get this information anyway. The Watchmen, that Raheem saw, these shows, Lovecraft Country, there's comic books now. There's so much about Tulsa, about Greenwood, about the massacre, about the history of this community in the popular culture now. And there are more movies and more documentaries coming. There are more comic books coming. And so children are going to get this anyway. And so I think that just the more tools that we can provide for students, the better. It helps parents and families to talk about this history with their children. And it helps teachers teach this history in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Christopher asks, can we provide a list of books about more American race massacres against African Americans? There's a wonderful book called Red Summer by, I'm blanking on the name, but the title is Red Summer. I have students read parts of it. McWhirter, 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 Red Summer, really great book about the 1919 race attacks, riots, massacres in some cases. Cheryl asks, would Tulsa's Jewish residents, friends or foes after the, so she's asking about the relationship between Jews and African Americans at the period of the massacre, something that I'm afraid I have nothing that would bear on that question. Do either of you?
Phil, do you know about the Zero family? I know they had a grocery store in Greenwood. They're a prominent Jewish family, philanthropic family who had built an oil fortune. Russian Jewish immigrants who had a grocery store in Greenwood, but I don't know too much about the family history. Although I would be fascinated to know more.
Yeah, agreed. There's not a lot of context in terms of the direct role of Jewish Americans in the days following. What we do have in terms of I think the modern term now since George Floyd is white allies. I try to give people context when I present this. The mob numbered anywhere from 1,500 to 2,500, the white mob that came in. There were 90,000 people living in Tulsa at the time of the massacre. So, I try to let people know not every white person in Tulsa was trying to kill Black people. But it's the silence of those that sat on the sidelines and did not do anything to stop. But the days afterwards, we have minutes from Holy Cathedral Church, large white Catholic church downtown. We have minutes from First Presbyterian Church and their pastor that was actually run out of town because of the role that he was playing in trying to say this was wrong, this was horrible, this was a sin against our fellow mankind, and we should help these people. He ended up having to leave the pastorate of that church a year later because of all that he was speaking out. First Methodist Church, these churches actually housed many of, in their basements, fed and went and took care of. So, there were many white allies. We just don't have a lot of context historically accurate that we can speak on in terms of the true role of some of the Jewish populations here after the massacre.
Phil, am I correct in remembering that it was a Jewish family who provided some of the funding to rebuild Mount Zion?
Yes, that is true. That is true. When Mount Zion started to rebuild, yes, there was. And I don't know the family name, but that is true for Mount Zion.
I think there's more historical research to be done there.
Yeah.
But the couple of stories that I do know point to an allyship there, a recognition that this was something that the Jewish community could help Greenwood.
Somebody asks, this is Donald, how much political influence did Black citizens of Tulsa have at the time of the massacre? Well, that's a complicated one, isn't it? I mean, because for reasons that we've talked about, the community was very self-contained, for one. Is there anything in your research, Carlos, that would speak to that question in particular?
The answer that I would give would be that the leaders of Greenwood, both the faith leaders of Greenwood, the journalists of Greenwood, people like A.J. Smitherman, the business, the entrepreneurship community in Greenwood, had power in their voice in the publications. Had power in the land and the businesses that they owned, but very little political power. So as I mentioned earlier, there was a housing ordinance that segregated Tulsa by law that was passed in 1916. And although Greenwood protested this very heavily, they were not able to have enough political clout that they could reverse this decision by the city. There wasn't political representation at the local level, and here I'm talking about, the city council, for example, or positions like the chief of the fire department or the chief of police. There wasn't local political representation until I would say, we're looking at maybe the 80s, and early 90s. So it's quite recent that there was even one Black city council member for the city of Tulsa, and I don't believe there has been a person of color who's been mayor of Tulsa yet. So that's something that we still have some work to do there.
And even with the influence with the authority, there was the Tulsa Police Department actually would deputize Black citizens, and their role, their authority was to patrol the Greenwood District. They had authority to arrest Black citizens, but they could not arrest white citizens. Even if that white citizen was breaking crime and doing something in Greenwood, they had no jurisdiction within their own jurisdiction to arrest white citizens. They only could arrest Black citizens. But just lets you know, the level of, the supremacy or the white supremacy that you couldn't even patrol your own neighborhoods without our influence. And that even with urban renewal, not having, the reason urban renewal was so destructive to Black communities like Greenwood, because there were, let's face it, there were no people of color sitting around the table. When you're talking about a highway system coming through, it always went through the path of least resistance. If someone's not sitting at the table to say, those are my constituents, that's my neighborhood, that's where I live, you're not gonna build a highway and do eminent domain. It always said, take it to the Black community. No one was there to protest. So yeah, that's been the case throughout history in a lot of our communities. A lot of things that happen because no one's at the table to speak up for that community.
Okay, the final word. I just got the message from Raheem. We need to wrap up, right, Raheem? So let me just pass things over to you. Sorry to just interrupt our flow there, but over to you, Raheem. I know that we are at the end.
Yeah, sorry about that. I know this can go on forever, but I would like to thank you all for your time today. This was great. I feel honored that this was one of my first big programs, and I was happy to meet you all and share this with our audience. This was a great learning experience, but I would like to just in closing say that it doesn't have to stop now. It doesn't have to end. This is not forgotten history. This is untold history. And there's many other stories that are untold, and the best thing we can do is to share our experience that we had here today, continue to educate ourselves, and really advocate for these stories to be heard. And in closing, I would like to thank the whole museum for giving me this opportunity. I would like to thank our audience today. And again, I would like to thank all of our panelists. Please check out the links in the chat. There's a link to our survey. There's a link to our upcoming events. There's a link to how you can support Dr. Gray, Carlos, Phil. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you all in future programs.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Raheem. That was wonderful, and everyone else.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Have a good night. Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Carlos.